Greco. We're back on Empowered by the Spirit, high atop the Tower of Hope here in beautiful Christ Cathedral in Orange County, California, with Father Robert Spitzer. And we're talking about fundamental apologetics. We're talking about the evidence for Christ. And one of the areas that has been controversial is the Shroud of Turin. It was debunked by the dating in 1988. But now all of a sudden there's new evidence. Tell us about it, Father.
Yeah, I mean, maybe a little background just on the dating itself. The original protocol for the dating of the Shroud of Turin was that it was supposed to be, samples were supposed to be taken from 7 different places of the Shroud. And before the samples were taken, there was supposed to be scientific testing like fluorescing and so forth, and materials tests and thermochemical tests that would be done to assure that it really was the linen that which constitutes the majority of the shroud of herringbone linen, and not other kinds of replacement threads that might have come from the fire of Chambray, which would have been in the 14th century. Or actually in the 1400s, the 15th century in France. Some nuns actually put up some of the places that were, damaged by the fire. Now, the main thing, of course, was none of this happened. What happened was a single thread was taken from the shroud. And when that single thread taken, it was divided into 3 parts and then sent to the 3 labs. Now, 3 labs did, they're the highest reputation. They didn't do anything wrong. They carbon dated, exactly the samples that they had received. Unfortunately, the samples that they had received came from a very controversial spot. I mean, today we now have analyzed that spot very, very thoroughly. Dr. Ray Rogers did the samples from just above the spot where the samples, the actual sample for carbon dating was taken, and he found a series of real problematic things. First of all, the thread that comes from that sample separated, from a guide. What's called a dyed gum mordant, where it is basically a dyeing that takes place through a kind of a gumming agent, and this was done by the nuns. We know they dyed the cotton fibers that they sewed into the cloth. We know that was dyed to make it look like the linen, but in point of fact, those are cotton fibers. Those cotton fibers, after they had been thermochemically dated by Rogers, they come from the 15th century, not from the 1st century. So they were not dating anything from the herringbone, linen cloth that we suppose from the 1st century, and I'll tell you why we do in just a moment from other tests. But for all intents and purposes, that sample is not only seriously flawed, I mean, it's so seriously flawed. There's so little materials and thermochemical testing done, to verify that this was an authentic piece of the linen. And, it almost seems like, what were these guys trying to do? Pick the very sample that would kind of give rise to an erroneous dating? I'm not going to make any judgments, but I have to tell you something is terribly wrong. And Raymond Rogers, in peer-reviewed thermochemical study, Thermochemica, very well-known peer-reviewed journal of thermochemistry, actually declares positively this sample could not have been from the original shroud. It had to originate from the cloth that was used to fix the shroud in the 14th century. Just quickly moving through some of the dating that we now have. Ray Rogers himself, did what's called the vanillin test, and then another fellow by the name of Giulio Fanti did a series of other tests. One of them is called Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy. And another one, which is related but excites a different set of molecules to get different kinds of residual readings, was called Raman laser spectroscopy. Now, those tests themselves, right, including another one done by Giulio Fanti called, a compressibility and tension test, all of them basically gave rise to a testing result. Get this is 4 different tests of the linen, different fibers from the linen. placed it, the shroud, definitively to the 1st century, plus or minus about 110 years, with 96% confidence level. Now, that is certainly at variance with the carbon dating. And so for all intents and purposes, that carbon dating is not only suspect, it is clearly erroneous. Another carbon dating needs to be done. They have to have, materials experts that analyze it before samples are taken. They have to adhere to the original protocols, which were disobeyed at will by the committee by the people who took the samples. And for all intents and purposes, we will find when that's done that the actual linen does date back to the 1st century. There are other reasons, not from dating tests, why we can be quite sure that it's from the 1st century. First, there are pollen fossils embedded in the shroud, and the largest number of the pollen grains embedded in the shroud come from a guy by the name of Dr. Max Frey, a Swiss biologist, criminologist. And Frey identified the vast majority as coming from Jerusalem and the area of northern Judea. Hello? Does this sound like something familiar? That's the largest number. That's when the shroud was exposed to the most amount of air before it was put in any kind of frame or anything else. That's when it was moist and when it could absorb those kinds of pollen grains. 4 of those pollen grains are indigenous to that region. How in the world could, a 15th century French forger have figured out, that these pollen, they didn't have any science of pollen grains or fossils to begin with. Why would they plant the largest number from Jerusalem, and why, from that indigenous area? The second, from Edessa, Turkey, there's a reason for that, because the shroud moves from Jerusalem to Edessa, Turkey. The third area, Constantinople, because it moves from Edessa to Constantinople. The least number of pollen grains comes from France itself. Draw your own conclusions. Second thing of real importance, there are coins on the lids of the man in the shroud. So in other words, they took these Roman coins and they put them on the eyelids of the deceased person, so their eyes would not come open when they were enshrouded. So they're called Roman leptons. Now, I'm just going to say this right now. These coins have been definitively identified as Roman leptons that were from a special minting by Pontius Pilate in 29 AD. I mean, very difficult to replicate because they have 2 anomalies on the coins themselves and the Greek lettering, which clearly indicate that minting. How in the world did they get there? I know I'm probably going over time.
No, this is great. But I just have a quick question to ask you, because I, for one, have not been familiar with the Roman coins, and maybe a lot of our listeners are not. Yeah. Was this found at the same time as the shroud, or?
No, actually, when they did the photographing of the shroud, they, of course, did more and more precise, what's called digital photography, digital imaging of the shroud. Most of that was done in order to see whether it was really a true 3-dimensional image that you could actually produce a 3-dimensional image from. That's very important for the evidence of the resurrection. But in the very process of so doing, what they discover is, hey, there's clear images of these coins, on the shroud, the man's eyes. So this guy, Alan Wanger, or Wanger, I guess we'd call him here, he takes digital photographs of these very unusual Roman leptons, right, that come from that special minting of Pontius Pilate, and does a digital overlay of the coins on the man's eyes. And they're like exact.
Oh, so, praise the Lord. That's something I know I, for one, was not familiar with, and having read at least somewhat about the shroud, I'm sure many of our listeners have too. That is amazing evidence that I had not heard of before. But tell us more about the shroud as it relates to kind of what looks like an explosion,
Yeah.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah, exactly. You just have to, I can explain this, or you could go to a free article on my website. Go to magicenter.com and read this article called Science in the Shroud of Turin. But here's the short story right now of the evidence for the resurrection, the evidence for an immense amount of light coming from it. There are 5 anomalies on the image formation of the shroud. One of those anomalies is that it's on the what's called the surface of the fibrils. The image does not penetrate to the medulla of the fiber, which essentially means that it's on the barest surface. It's created a 3-dimensional image that is likened unto a very precise photograph on a non-photographically sensitive material like linen. So the key thing that's really important to see here is, how could such an image be produced? Can't be produced by any kind of an aromatic or vaporous thing. It couldn't be produced by a liquid. Those things would spangle and penetrate to the medulla easily. Couldn't be produced by scorching, etc. It has to be produced, and there's only one way of producing it. It was replicated by Paolo di Lazzaro in 2010 in 6 different kinds of experimental replications by excimer ARF laser. But the main thing to recognize is it has to be produced, as Dr. John Jackson suspected a long time ago, by vacuum ultraviolet radiation. Why that kind of radiation? Because that kind of radiation is very short-lived. You can get bursts that are 1/40,000,000th of a second in length. Now, why do you need the burst to be 1/40,000,000th of a second in length? Remember, you can't have the heat do it. It's not produced by scorching. It's got to be produced by light without the concomitant heat. So the source of the light can't last very long at all. 1/40,000,000th of a second probably at max. Why is that so? Because the amount of energy that would be required to produce that image on the Shroud of Turin is equivalent to several billion, with a B, several billion watts. Now, if you got several billion watts of light, it better be short-lived. Because if that thing lasts for more than 1/40,000,000th of a second, I'm telling you, it's fried. For all intents and purposes, we don't have a shroud left. But instead, we've got this perfect 3-dimensional photographic negative image of this man on the shroud. And the interesting thing is, like I said, it was replicated by Paolo di Lazzaro in 2010, been replicated by excimer ARF lasers since. The main point is, it would take 14,000 excimer ARF lasers to produce that kind of light, to produce that image. That's like being a few hundred miles away from the sun, and you're going to 1/40,000,000th of a second, you're going to see the sun's light direct on. This is the kind of light power we're talking about, emitting from a dead body. Like,
Hallelujah.
How do you explain that?
Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
Naturally.
We're going to be right back to learn more about this incredible evidence of Jesus' resurrection, the gift of the Holy Spirit. We'll be right back.